Hello there, I'm K-Ball, and welcome to Human Skills, where I interview tech industry leaders about all the non technical skills that go into success in the tech industry. Jamie Strachan worked his way up through various software roles until he reached architect, at which point he realized that increasingly his work was made up of people problems instead of software ones, and he decided to try management. In our conversation, we talked about that transition, how he had to come up with new ways of thinking about what it meant to do a good job, and how to determine what work matters. From there, we went deeper into the human aspects of leadership, talking about vulnerability and mental health. Jamie has been open about his struggles with depression, speaking about them both publicly and in more private settings, and we talked about how doing that as a leader can open the door for people that are not in positions of power to talk about and seek care for their own mental health challenges. Please enjoy this conversation with Jamie Strawn. Jamie, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to get to talk with you. Maybe let's start with you. Can you kind of introduce yourself, your background, and how you came to care about these things I've been calling human skills?
Yeah, I feel like my origin story is about as boring as it gets, but I'll go through it. So I've been a manager of software developers for about 6 years. But before that, I was a developer myself, and I went through what would be the most traditional path to get there, which was university for computer engineering. I through co-op terms, I found that web development was the thing that I liked the most. So went on to be a web developer. Mostly, this is back in like 2000. So web development was sort of a different beast back then, but uh,
Totally.
but yeah, but working at a bank, working at a small agency, and then eventually working as a developer in for any Canadians out there, the CBC, which is our public broadcaster. Americans might not be familiar with it, but it's a big deal up here in Canada. So learned a ton at the CBC about building for scale. So going from building websites that were getting hundreds of hits a month to millions and millions, and sort of how that changes, how you have to solve problems and that kind of thing, and what it's like to work with a team that's big enough to handle that. So I spent about 6 years at the CBC and sort of grew from basically a junior developer into much more senior technical leadership roles. So software architect. And that's really where things sort of turned for me towards management and the human skills that we sort of talk about. It became apparent that my ability to write code was sort of not the limiting factor in terms of what we could accomplish. That me being able to communicate with people and orchestrate and help people collaborate, help make sure that everyone was on the same page, like those things just contributed more to our sort of overall success. And so the longer I spent as kind of an architect, the more and more I was doing that, the less and less I was coding. And I kind of realized that, oh, these things, I think this is what a manager does. And so sort of decided like, oh yeah, maybe management is sort of where I want to go with this. At the time, again, large media company, the people managers were not that involved in the sort of like the work of the team, the project stuff. And I still wanted to be. So moved to a smaller company to be a manager, but like to really get to still stay pretty close to the work, even if I wasn't, making pull requests on a daily basis. Spent 2 years at one company. The last 4 years I spent at a company called Lupio, really kind of like working on, yeah, the human skills. Like, how do you help other people do this work? How do you help developers grow? How do you make sure people know how their work counts, what it matters for, why we're doing this, how to get better, all of those kinds of things. So yeah, that's absolutely been sort of my focus for the last number of years, and still learning, but I do feel like, I get a chance now to work with new leaders or team leads or people moving into leadership. And I
Hmm.
really like helping people figure that out now that I have at least some footing in that world.
Awesome. Yeah, I feel like there's a bunch of different threads we can go down. I'm actually kind of curious about that initial transition for you from being an architect to a manager. So you thought the work you're doing as an architect, oh, this is like what management is. Maybe I'll try that. Was it in fact the same, or were there things that you hadn't anticipated?
I mean, yes and no. It was certainly like to some degree what I expected. Like that's, you know, the focus becomes the people as opposed to the product, or, you know, the code, like thinking much more about the systems and processes that are about like how we communicate, as opposed to sort of like how this function interfaces with that function, how this class is structured. So I sort of knew that going into it. I think what I didn't realize was how, and I've been a developer for a very long time, so I had habits and, you know, defaults, reflexes, ways of measuring things like my success that stopped applying pretty quickly. you just you don't, you know, a lot of things in management are much longer term. They're less tangible. They're sort of harder to measure. And so I think like the part I didn't realize how to how difficult it would be for me to like adjust my frame of reference to like, am I doing a good job? Like, what does a good job look like as a manager? Because I just, you know, didn't have some of the touch points I've been used to for years and years as a developer.
Totally. And I think that's an extremely common problem. Have you
Yeah.
come to a good framework about how you assess, like, am I doing a good job as a manager?
I mean, I think the first step of it was to, even for myself, like just come to terms with uh, the fact that, again, like my contributions were not going to be based in the code that I wrote. So like again, it's just that's what I was used to. And so when I started as a manager, if a problem would come up, I'd sort of be like, "Ooh, like I can fix this." And it was sort of like a learning process to be like, "Sure, maybe I can fix this, but there are other ways that these can be fixed." Makes opportunities for other developers, giving people a just chance to do this. And again, instead of that feeling like, oh, I'm failing because there's a thing that I could do that I'm not doing, feeling like, oh, this is actually a, you know, a win, in the sense that, again, it's a learning opportunity for somebody else. It's a chance for me to spend time working on something that's higher leverage, again, like communication alignment, than, you know, fiddling with a PR that that a senior dev could do way faster than me. So part of it was just that mindset shift. I think the other part of it is, again, like understanding the time scale of what success looks like. Like like I said, I got into web development mainly because the feedback loop is so fast, right? Like I loved being able to write JavaScript or change CSS and like immediately see what the impact was on the screen. I'd done backend before that, and it was just sort of, I don't know, less rewarding to work for hours, days, months, and then like, you know, hopefully data got transferred to the right place or whatever. It's just like, it's just far less tangible and visible. So front end web development, the feedback loop was very quick. Management, less so. So you're thinking in terms of quarters, in terms of like years when it comes to people's growth, learning skills, getting promoted, all those kinds of things. So you also just have to like realize that your day-to-day activities are really going to be cumulative in terms of like major outcomes, as opposed to sort of, you know, you finish an 8-hour day and you're like, oh, you know, here are the 10 things that I like took from start to finish, because that just doesn't really happen anymore.
Totally. Before we get into, I know you mentioned you've done a lot about helping new managers and new leaders, but before we get into that, I want to dig on one other point that you mentioned in your introduction, which is this question of how you help people know that their work matters or why they're
Right.
doing their work. I'm curious, how do you think about that, and do you have any frameworks or tactics you use to make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the easy answer to this, which I don't know if it's the most effective answer. Like, I think depending on, like, I've worked in companies that are, say, B2C, for example, where you can point to, like, well, here's the feature that you're working on, and like, here's a customer that's going to use it. And sure, like, therefore, you know, this work you're doing is improving their life in some way, which is like not wrong or anything. But again, I've found that even that feedback loop is longer than you kind of want it to be. Like by the time a feature gets developed and tested and rolled out and through feature flags and A/B testing and whatever else it takes for it to like finally get used, and then hopefully you get like actual feedback from a customer saying this is a great thing. Like there's a long time between the sort of start of that process and the end of that process. So that may be the most like direct line to draw, but it's not as, I don't know, tangible again, or as like as rewarding maybe as as developers want. So I think one of the things you can do is look at the people who are much closer to you and how your work impacts them. And I, especially working with say senior developers, like mentoring, for example, or pairing, are like really nice, quick, tangible ways for you to realize that like, okay, yes, sure, I'm helping a customer with this thing they need to do, but also like I'm helping this developer that I sit next to learn this skill or get this PR done or figure out what's wrong with this test that's failing. And like, so that measurement of value and reward doesn't have to always be drawn all the way to like the bottom line and ARR and customer satisfaction. There's lots of internal metrics for who it is that you're helping and what your work is doing to benefit your peers.
Totally. I have found that over the course of my career, and some of this may be as I started doing more management, but even when I'm in an engineering role, I value my work by the impact it has on making my immediate peers' lives better.
Yeah,
And the final code delivery is less and less of how I measure myself, even
yeah,
when code delivery is my core job.
yeah. I think it's totally true. And again, like it was something that really dawned on me when I was working at CBC was just how much of a team sport this whole thing is. Like it's not to say that like individual small groups like can't get things done, but you really unlock and like multiply the amount of impact that you can have by like working closely with other people. And that is a whole set of skills, it's a whole set of challenges. And so yeah, like again, it's a pretty immediate measure, like you say, to be thinking about like, okay, like not just this line of code that I'm delivering, but this person's life that I've made easier, or that I've taught something, or they've taught something, or I've just helped them get through a struggle or whatever. I think that stuff is great to sort of point out to people, because I think it gets taken for granted a little bit, right? It starts to just be like, oh, I approved this person's pull request, and that's just the job, as opposed to like, oh, that was actually a valuable thing in that, again, it helps this person get unstuck. It maybe provided some insights, some comments to them that help them do better. Like all those things are super valuable and way more immediate than, again, like launching the feature or the product.
Totally. Well, and I think those relationships that you build in the course of that are also more durable,
Yeah.
right? Like very little of the code I wrote early in my career still exists in the world. Nobody's running those products. Like the world has moved on, but some of those first relationships I still see and talk to and meet up with those people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting part of the journey too, from a junior developer, that most junior developers, and like for good reason, are really focused on the technical skill stuff, right? Like, you just feel like you have to prove that you can do this work, that you could, accomplish tasks, close bugs, whatever it is. And like, oh, that's true. But yeah, I mean, I even coaching junior devs to not overlook the fact that they can make other contributions, whether it's even by the questions that they ask, or like you said, like the relationships they have, like all those things are super valuable beyond just like, okay, I've got to get super good at MVC or whatever it is, like, whatever it is you need to learn for this job or that job.
Totally. Well, so now let's lean into this question of making people's lives better, but from the perspective of new managers, new leaders. How do you make their lives better?
Yeah. Again, like the big shift for me was like trying to recalibrate where my impact, or the most leverage I had to make impact was. I think especially new managers, especially ones coming from an engineering background, people who've been developers for a long time, it's easy to reach for the comfort of like getting back into the code. And so like it's a good thing to pay attention to when you have that instinct, and how you can postpone your moving into something identified as an opportunity for other people. I think like people get into engineering and development because they like solving problems, which is great. Solving problems, wonderful. Just you now as a leader have an opportunity to address different types of problems than your developers do. And sometimes I think when you're getting started, it's easy to sort of like fall back into the types of problem solving that you're used to. And I don't know, it's scary to like try and address the problems, the challenges that come from like interpersonal dynamics and, misunderstandings, collaboration, alignment. Those things are way harder than just like, oh, here's a bug, I'm gonna go fix it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so once they get into that, do you have any frameworks you give them to start tackling those scarier problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the like we were sort of talking about measurement, right? I think like that's one way for people to start is to try and come up with what metrics they want to start using as a manager to measure their own success. Again, the ones they're used to are probably not that relevant anymore. And I mean, you mentioned how frequently do I help my colleagues and stuff, and that's a sort of, maybe you could look at that as kind of nice to have as a developer. It is essential as a manager. That is the core of that role. So if you haven't already sort of been thinking about that, it's definitely like, a big part of how have I helped the team today, right? Like what things have I unblocked? What challenges have I unearthed? Um, but I also think like, you mentioned relationships too. For people starting in management, especially, so I've worked with some people who say take over a team that they've worked with versus other people who sort of come into a team fresh. And I think even for people who come into like start managing a team they've worked with, I think it's easy to overlook just how important like relationship building is, and maybe to some degree redefining, right? Like you may have worked with these people as a peer and now you're sort of working with them as their boss or whatever. But yeah, like reestablishing sort of like what that looks like, and not in a, it doesn't have to be like put your foot down. I'm the boss now. I'm going to tell you what to do. But to like to redefine like what the relationship is in terms of like what you can offer. And so even if you've worked with these people for a long time, like one-on-ones are a incredibly powerful tool for just getting to know people. And it feels weird to just kind of index heavily on like, oh, I'm just going to have these one-on-ones with people, and like that's valuable in a way that again feels very different than the kind of value you're adding like writing tests or what have you. Uh, but I've seen a lot of people sort of struggle at the beginning when they haven't really focused on relationship building at the beginning.
Yeah, totally. So do you have, well, a few different things you said there that I love. So one, I think when you move into a management role, redefining your relationships is really important. Making
Yeah,
it explicit, because like it is a disservice to you and them to act as if nothing has changed. Like purely the fact that there is a little bit of a power dynamic will change the relationship.
yeah,
And if you don't address that, then it can get like different people have different assumptions. It can get toxic. It can be people, your reports will be like, well, how am I supposed to treat this guy? Like it's hard.
yeah,
Um, and then, yeah, to your point, one-on-ones are extremely effective as a tactic, but they feel super vague, especially like you've never done this before. Like, what am I supposed to do in a one-on-one? Do you have a way that you think about them?
yeah. I've my thinking on one-on-ones evolves a lot, and I sort of am still thinking about how to do it, and I'll even like change up my approach depending on the team or how I feel or how they feel, the state of our relationship, whatever it is. But I think like at its core, I I absolutely want to enshrine like one-on-ones as an opportunity for like my report to have my undivided attention. And I think it's something that's so easy to lose track of. Things get busy, there's lots of things happening, and for me to like carve that out and make sure that this person knows that what it is that they need to talk to me about is the most important thing that I could be doing at that point is really important. And some people completely love that, right? They think it's great. They would love to just have their manager's ear for half an hour or whatever and have lots of things to talk about. Other people, less so. If, other people may not have had a manager where they have that kind of opportunity and kind of don't know what to do with it. So, I normally want to structure it with lots of time for whatever is on their mind. And that may be just chatting, that may be helping them solve a problem, that may be sort of working through a particular skill gap, whatever it is. Um, and then, yeah, like, so normally it'll be, I don't know, let's say half and half, two-thirds, one-third. There'll be some time for me and my agenda. And that again, sometimes that's tactical. That's about, needing to make sure that they understand something that's going on in the organization. It may be growth conversations. I think, again, it's it's easy sometimes to stay and live in the sort of tactical day to day, sprint to sprint stuff, and sort of forget about like, yeah, how are you progressing to your next level, your career, that kind of thing. So I normally have time sort of allocated to that on a regular basis. But I don't know. Like I said, I go back and forth between having something super structured and something that just is is what it needs to be when
Hmm.
when someone needs to talk to me. And like I say, making sure
Totally.
that's kind of enshrined in both of our calendars.
Totally. Yeah, I think it's really important to just have the opportunity there so that things can come up. And I think you asked something like, what's on your mind?
Yeah,
Such a powerful question.
yeah,
And especially combined with the willingness to let there be empty space.
yeah. That's something I still find challenging. But yeah, for sure. Like yeah, there's some people who you ask them what's on your mind, and no problem feel like a half hour conversation. And yeah, there are other people who are quite reticent, and I have had the opportunity to manage some people for a very long time, like for had a relationship for like 4 years, and other people you're just getting to know, and so obviously that evolves what people are willing to talk about, um, how much they're willing to share, what's appropriate, not appropriate to talk about with my boss, um, and this may be a sort of a segue into something else that we were chatting about, but I use like vulnerability to help like establish a sort of connection with people. I don't tend to start, the first time I meet someone, just be like, what's on your mind? And expect them to sort of like launch into a bunch of really deep, like important stuff for them. Um, so again, like your mileage sort of varies based on the relationship, but I was starting it with someone new, I want to create the sort of space for them to be able to share by normally like sharing some stuff myself. So where I am, where I've come from, and sort of like the challenges that I'm facing, or what's going on with me, not to kind of like dump on them, but to give them like some sense of me as like a human, as opposed to just again a like abstract boss figure or whatever it is, member like a spokesperson for the company.
Totally. Let's maybe follow that thread a little bit. So you mentioned vulnerability and sharing things. How do you think about vulnerability as a leader or a manager?
Yeah, I learned years ago that if the more that I'm able to sort of be vulnerable and share things with people, the more it gives them an opportunity to. And this sort of, to me, ties in with like leadership and management, because it almost becomes a like an obligation to some degree. Like the power dynamic is such that if I'm a manager and I'm speaking to a direct report, it is riskier for them to tell me certain things, right? Like they might be concerned about the precariousness of their position, or even just basic stuff. If they're worried that if they talk about struggles they're having, like they're going to get fired as opposed to supported, that's a very difficult place to have like a relationship that is is candid and is useful and valuable. So for me, yeah, like I look at it as, for me to be vulnerable, for me to talk about challenges I'm having and things like that, it just helps sort of open the door and like helps lead. And again, like basically use the fact that I'm in this sort of power position, and to be the one to broach it, right? To make a demonstration that like, yes, we can talk about this stuff, and I'm willing to go first because again, like I have theoretically less to lose, let's say.
Yeah, well, and I think it's really powerful, and it sometimes inverts people's perceptions of what it means to be the boss or a
Yeah,
leader, right? Like I think I don't know where it comes from. Maybe it's popular culture or something, but there's this idea of the boss as the like perfect macho whatever it is, and it's not an effective way to lead.
yeah. Yeah, I feel like I've come across like multiple inversions like that in my life, where like, you're a kid and you like see your parents and all the adults and you're like, oh wow, they have it figured out. And then you become an adult and you're like, oh, they don't have it figured out. Or like, or even like interviewing. Like I remember when I was a student, like interviewing for roles and just going in feeling like I am begging for a job here, right? Like I am just hoping that these these wonderful people will like accept me or whatever and let me into their club. And like the more I've done hiring, the more I'm like, oh, this is like nobody here has all the answers, and it's like so much more effective to be able to converse with people and sort of meet them at their level as opposed to, shine a big spotlight directly in their eyeballs and and interrogate them for half an hour. So I think the boss is the same thing. Like you can have managers that that you know maybe project or maybe live like a much more, let's say, commanding figure. And I mean, it's never how I've been personally, but I also think like as a manager, I've never seen examples of that being effective, like for the type of leadership that I want, for the type of team that I want to work with. So yeah, I'm much more inclined to like, again, use the opportunity that I have as a leader to like demonstrate vulnerability, to demonstrate like how we can talk about things that maybe aren't perfect and aren't great and we want to do better on, but as a way to open that door.
I think this might be an interesting area to explore more, this concept of inversion, because in the interview example you highlight, right, coming in as someone being interviewed, if you mentally are in the space of I'm interviewing these people as much as they're
Yeah,
interviewing me, not only does it feel better, it works better.
totally, totally does. Yeah. Yeah, when
Well,
I
and I think you highlighted this for bosses as well, right? Like as a leader, me being more vulnerable maybe feels less natural, but it's more effective.
Yeah, yeah. I think like I said, when I went to university, we did this co-op program, which meant that every 4 months we were applying for and looking for jobs. And so like I went through dozens and dozens of interviews to try and get these things. And it was, when I first started, I'm, going out to tech companies asking them to hire me when what I have on my resume is like 8 months of an engineering, like an introductory engineering degree, and all my other experiences, like I was a camp counselor and worked for elections camp, like just stuff that is nothing. And so I certainly felt like I was like, yes, please just give me a job. I need something. I have a lot of potential, but that's it. Uh, but the more I went through that process, yeah, like you said, the more I sort of realized that I have, I bring value to this conversation, and I don't want to just have a job. I would like to have a job where, I want to work with these people. I sort of understand where they're coming from. I feel like, that this is more of a fit as opposed to, again, like a, me begging situation. And so, again, like modeling that, like when I go into interviews as a hiring manager, like I want the same thing. I don't want people to come into an interview feeling like they are, again, being interrogated, just because, like you said, like you don't get the best results like that. Like I'm not going to see what a person is like when they would be, in the job if they are sweating bullets in our interview, right? Like if they're just too scared to give a good answer or think things through, like then it's not a good representation of what they can do for me as a hire. So yeah, same thing, like trying to level set and sort of like create the space, whether it's an interview, it's a one-on-one, to sort of like, and me be the one to like demonstrate I'm willing to go first on being vulnerable, on sort of like setting tone, because again, that's like my level of sort of power level in the exchange affords me that. And, again, hopefully demonstrates to the other person that they can operate at the same level.
Absolutely. Are there any other situations you found that type of inversion from how you expected it to be to what turns out to be effective?
Uh, I mean, the other things like we had chatted about was like public speaking. Like I remember going to conferences and seeing the people like presenting up on stage and being like just in awe of these incredible, brilliant, like wonderful people, like these celebrities or whatever it was. And I remember like a number of years ago, I sort of decided that getting into like public speaking, presenting at conferences was like something I wanted to do. And same thing, like when I got into it, I was like, oh, I'm just a guy. Like there is like nothing that magical about me getting up on stage and doing this. Like it's a skill, sure, and it's something you can practice, but like it is not the sort of rarefied air that I thought it was. Of just like, only the most elite could possibly do this thing. So even that was like, again, it's like it's so nice, I think, sometimes to sort of like to be able to relate to people on that kind of level, like to reduce that gap. Again, it's like when I've done speaking before, like I coach people on public speaking and have done before because I'm like, again, it's a skill, you can learn it, but it's also like, I don't know, it's neat. I like going to conferences and having people like come up to me and talk to me about stuff that I'm interested in because I like gave a talk about it, as opposed to, me walking into a room full of strangers and being like, oh, I have to make small talk.
Oh, it's a phenomenal like connection networking hack for the introverts among
Yeah.
us, right?
Oh
Because
yeah.
then like people will come to you.
Yeah. It's so great. But yeah, but same thing again, like, I it's so it's always interesting for me to get a glimpse of, the other side of something. And it's like, oh right, these people are, this is, sounds like some sort of silly like Hollywood cliche, like, oh, they're just like me, this A-list actor also goes to the grocery store or what have you. Like, but yeah, I mean, again, I think like when we have an opportunity to be in uh, a position to sort of like have that, power is not quite the right word, but um, we can demonstrate to everyone else that like, no, no, this isn't that big a deal. I mean, I'm going to sort of tie in like privilege here too. Like I'm a, cis het white guy. Like there's a lot of reasons why, like, again, I can be someone who can be more vulnerable or who can do things that like other people might be in a more precarious position and not be able to or not feel comfortable doing. So like that's an opportunity for me, but like again, like borders on obligation to some degree. Like why would I not use this? I want to say ability. It's not an ability because wasn't something I earned, but like this again opportunity to sort of like to demonstrate what an exchange or a relationship can be like, because I'm sort of coming in with this quote unquote power or whatever as part of the dynamic.
Totally. Well, and I think it's interesting. There's so many different pieces that you wove into that I'd love to kind of unpack. So, starting I think with the speaking piece, one of the things you highlighted there that I think plays out in a lot of these is like we see someone doing this thing that feels impossible to us.
Yeah.
They're on stage talking to 100 people and they seem confident and all these different things. And we're like, oh, that is a different type of human being than I am.
Yeah.
And what you said is no, it's a skill, but it's a learnable skill.
Yeah.
That is the same type of human being with the same insecurities and the same types of internal challenge, but they have spent the time and energy or paid the coaches or done whatever to build up that skill. Uh, and I think to your highlight, similar thing with like the boss, the executives. Like, they're not fundamentally different, but they do have different skills that they've invested in and learned.
Yeah, and I think there's a really useful. I think there's a value in, again, like being realistic about what those things are. That again, this person who's speaking at a conference is like, it's not magic, right? It's not like this inborn talent that nobody else can have. It's a skill and it takes practice. But that also doesn't mean that like everybody could and should do the same thing. Like you may not be cut out to be a public speaker for all sorts of reasons, and like that's okay. That's fine. Like it's something that I enjoy doing, and it's something like I like helping people who maybe don't think they can like learn at least they can, so that then they can choose whether or not it is sort of like what they want or not. But as soon as yeah, whether it's management, it's speaking, whatever it is, like if you shut the door on that for yourself because you're just like, oh, I could never, right? Like I can't be that person. I didn't grow up this way, or I'm not born like that. I don't have this predisposition. Like, well, okay, we can get past that so that at least you can kind of like think rationally about like, yeah, okay, maybe I could be a manager, but I don't want to be. And that's fine. Like, this is the other thing about management is like, management is not for everyone, and not every developer should be a manager, and not every manager has to be a developer. And like, there's overlap. It's great, but you can, like you said, like you can learn management skills. They're not inborn, but that doesn't mean that everyone has to. Management is not like be all end all. Hopefully, I think companies are getting better at this, like giving people other paths that are not just like, oh, you're going to cap out as an IC, and so now the only way up is like management, and sort of everyone who hits senior is just like forced into being a manager, whether they like it or not. Like, yeah, I like helping people make more rational decisions about those kinds of things that maybe they can do, maybe they want to, maybe they don't. That's okay. But at least you can face that.
Yeah. Well, so let me ask then, do you have an analysis framework you walk people through? Or like how do you help make that rational decision?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I have so for example, for going from like say technical IC to manager, I think normally like, and you can maybe apply the same thing to like public speaking, but I think there's sort of like a Venn diagram of you know the skills that are inherent in being a senior IC. There's skills that are inherent in being a manager. Those things overlap at some point, right? Like I think being a senior IC, you absolutely need crisp communication skills. You need to be able to collaborate. You need to be able to sort of like understand and interpret the big picture. You need to be able to like take initiative and make decisions without guidance, that kind of thing. Those are all great as a manager. But there are other things like some developers, they just love the like heads down 6 hours straight of like focus work type stuff. Like they love the feeling of being able to like write a great suite of tests or really like knock out a complex refactor. And like those aren't things that you are going to get from management. And so it's like, again, trying to be realistic about, yes, these are the things that you can absolutely carry over, but these are things that are probably not going to be a part of that. And if you're okay with letting those things go and moving into these other things, wonderful. Then like, yeah, we should look at management. Same with conference speaking. Like conference speaking is not easy, but it's also like not so difficult that you can't learn it. Just know that of things that you've done, of things you're able to do, if you're able to give a 2-minute tech demo to your company when you finish at the end of a sprint or something, like the core of it's there. But do you want to like take that further into, okay, in order to make a half-hour presentation to 100 people, again, the Venn diagram, it overlaps, but also like there's this other stuff that you need to add to it. And if you want to go there, marvelous. If you don't, that's fine. But like just being sort of realistic about where that stuff overlaps and where it doesn't.
Yeah, that makes sense. So taking that particular example, because I'm curious, somebody's able to give a 2-minute tech demo. How would they take that and translate it to a conference talk?
So, I mean, I think that like the very fundamental piece of it is, again, like to my mind is the same. Like I think if you can communicating to a large group of people, to my mind, has a lot to do with like basically just knowing what you were trying to say. Like, what is the purpose of what you are presenting? Why are you doing it? Why to this audience? How is it that you are crafting your delivery to like make sure that that message meets this audience? I think it's easy to sort of like not think that hard about that when it's, oh, I fixed this bug. Because it's like, well, the story kind of tells itself. But if you want to expand that to something broader, it's a more complex set of reasoning to sort of think like, okay, my audience is going to be 150 tech enthusiasts or JavaScript developers or what have you. And the thing I want them to do or learn or uncover is this. And you need to be more, like, I guess, sort of deliberate and like it takes more to craft a 45-minute conference talk than it does a 2-minute tech demo. So I think part of it is like spending the time on doing that, like being able to and being willing to, but also being like, pretty dedicated to understanding like how challenging it is to like to communicate with an audience like that. Like there are lots of things in your way that just, it's 150 people out there in the audience that have different things on their mind. And like, it's wonderful that you have a great idea of something you want to talk to them about, but like, how do you do it? How do you learn about the kind of, psychology and the kind of delivery, not tricks, but
So do you have any particular, say I was coming to you and I said, I've got this great 2-minute. It worked great. I gave it to my fellow engineers. I want to take it to a local meetup. What
right.
concretely, how do I transform it? Like this thing to that?
So I think, again, one of the biggest differences in your sort of 2-minute to 15-minute or 20-minute presentation, the meetup is like you're going to need more than that. So what is it that you are trying to get this audience to understand that is going to take, that is like worth 20 minutes of their time versus what's worth 2 minutes at a time? And maybe this idea is it, in which case, like, okay, well, now we just have to figure out, like, great, like, what's the bigger message that you're trying to get across? If it's as simple as like, oh, I wanted to teach, the company about this thing I did in 2 minutes, and now I want to teach this bigger group about it in 20 minutes. Great, but like, there's got to be more to help support that message, to help make sure that you are reaching this audience, which is different than your sort of internal audience of stakeholders. What is important to them? Why is this thing that you want to show them important? What is it about you showing them this thing that is like why they should come hear you talk about it? And to sort of like, let's figure out how we can enhance what is sort of like a simple core idea into something that is a really compelling and like 20-minute
So, but what's
presentation.
going to make it compelling? So I'll make it very concrete because I want
Yeah.
to walk through this process with you and see what it looks like. So, um, I presented a 2-minute demo about React Query or something, and I said, "This is a cool library. We should be using it. Here's what it's going to let us do." And now I want to take this to my local JavaScript meetup and say, "Okay, y'all, you should be using React Query. What do I need to add
So I
to
mean, I
make it?"
think like, yeah, I think what you need to know is who the audience is. So like, why should they reuse React Query, right? Like, what do you
Mhm.
know about it that they want to know about it? You can go tell all sorts of different people about React Query. Some of them will not care. If you tell the people in line at the grocery store about React Query, most likely it is not going to matter to them. So what is it that is about your topic and that audience that is going to connect with them? And like I think understanding who that audience is and what value like you have for them. Why did you use React Query? Like, what benefit did it give you? What benefit is it going to give them? And how do you, again, if you're framing this message like you all should use React Query, that's a great message. So, what are the different things that you need to build into a presentation to convince them of that? What are the challenges that they are facing that you are able to solve, or they would be able to solve with React Query, right? Like, you, depending on how much you know about the audience, you may know quite clearly what it is that React Query solves. You may not, but you can research those things. But it's figuring out like, if that is the outcome that you want, then what are the supporting arguments you are going to make for this as a case?
So if I were going to echo back, part of the thing is they have less shared context. I'm doing it internally. There's this
Yes.
implicit context. I know we're all using React, for example. I know that we're all dealing with some state management stuff or whatever it is. And so I can present React Query as like assuming the context, you guys are already in that. But if I go to a JavaScript meetup, I need to make that explicit, right? So I need to say, most of you all are probably using React. And we know that from the numbers, right? 80% of JavaScript developers these days are doing something
Yeah.
in React, or front end, or whatever, right? So you say most of you all are probably using React. You probably have a state management problem, and it looks something like this. And making that implicit context explicit, and letting,
Right.
I mean, I think one key piece of this is some people in that set won't be in your audience, but you need to tell them that
Yeah.
so that the people who are tune in and they say, "Oh, this isn't for me. Okay,
Yeah.
I can tune out."
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I think being very clear on what it is you are offering, right? Like, presumably you are offering React Query or whatever it is for specific reasons. And you're right that like if you can be clear on what those reasons are, then everyone in the audience can be clear. They're like, oh, this doesn't apply to me. That's fine, right? Like, oh yeah, if you're having real problems with state management, let me tell you about how we use React Query, and I'll tell you a great story and make it compelling and sort of like really hone in on like these are the challenges we're facing. This is how this solution worked for us. Maybe here are the caveats or whatever it is, but like again, trying to paint this picture for people who, like you said, maybe have a different context about what it is, why it is you came to this decision, and why you think other people should follow. And yeah, like that's the other thing about like giving presentations is like it's fine if you aren't completely like directly tapping into the brains of every single person in that room. Like it's okay. I like just as much like if you give a presentation sort of like two people come up to you afterwards and be like, that was exactly what I needed to hear, as opposed to, 100 people being like, yeah, that's fine. Like if like you said, sort of, if you're clear about what it is that you want to do, you can narrowcast to some degree and make sure that what you're doing really hits for some of those people. And yeah, other people may not care, but that's okay.
Well, you can also, I think, tell them, you may not be in this situation now,
Yet,
but
yeah,
let me tell you how you would know you're in this situation. So,
yeah,
leading into the React query example, you may not be using React right now, but we know by the data lots of companies are. So maybe next job
yeah,
you will be, right? You
yeah.
might still want to pay attention.
Yeah, I mean, again, like I think you could be going into that situation with different intent, right? Like you could be going into that. Let's say hypothetically, it's not React Query. It's like it's a product you are selling, right? This is not just, oh, it's a cool library that I found, I think could help you. It's like, I would like you to pay me money so that you can use my library, or you can hire me as a consultant. Like, yeah, you're probably going to go in with a bit of a different tack if if there's money on the line. Again, like selling, your is not just about sort of like telling all the people everything. It is still about sort of finding the right audience for your thing. And so, yeah, you might go in, you might have sort of, I don't know, lower stakes to some degree if you're just like, hey, I found a cool library and I want to tell you all about it. And it's fine if sort of like, people take it or leave it. Maybe less fine if your livelihood is depending on people buying your product. And so, yeah, I mean, like, 20 minutes might not be enough, or might be too much, or, this might be not really the right audience. But yeah, I mean, I know I'm sort of being vague. I think like a lot of what I've done when I'm sort of like coaching people in public speaking is like, I think there is so much, it's so important to know specifically what you are trying to accomplish and how that lines up with this audience. So like, yes, there are things in general that, again, you can learn about delivery and stuff, but I think the hardest part is really spending the time to get clear on who it is that you are speaking to and what it is that you want from them. And that then helps lead to like, okay, then now what's the most effective way for me to do this, right? And that opens up, all sorts of doors, whether it's, oh, this is maybe it's through audio only, maybe it's through a demonstration, maybe it's through a panel discussion. I don't know, but like you knowing what it is that you want the audience to get out of it and who the audience is, I think like I've always found helps clarify sort of what works and what doesn't, or what's important and what's not when you're trying to come up with sort of like how to address something.
Totally. That makes a ton of sense. And I think it highlights that it may not be the right thing to say, oh, I want to go talk at that conference. You got to start and say, who am I trying to reach with what? Okay,
Yeah,
now let me look. Where do they sit? Where are they at this conference? Are they at that? Are they only online? Like, how do I reach those people?
yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I mean, if you're lucky and have an audience, then great. If you're trying to find an audience, yeah, that's a different challenge. I mean, I don't know. I've applied to conferences and stuff with just pitches, and you know, you hope for the best, but also like there is a there's a group of people deciding whether or not like what you are proposing that works for their audience, and if it doesn't, that's fine. Like, save me some trouble of coming in and trying to talk about something your audience isn't going to care about. That's great. I would rather not do that.
Totally. So we're getting close to time. I remember one last thing that you had flagged to me that might be worth talking about is the role of mental health and how managing your own mental health or helping others with theirs kind of shows up at work.
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of bring this back to, we were talking before about like vulnerability. So I have been I've been pretty open with like mental health challenges that I've had in the past. I have talked about public speaking. Like I have gotten up on stage multiple times and talked to people about my depression. And again, like that is something I feel like I can do. Um, but I also like I feel like doing that again, like hopefully, again, sort of like either opens the door or at least gives other people an opportunity to see someone in sort of my position, like being open and vulnerable with that. So it's not like I don't I don't go around like waving a big flag about carrying a big sign that says how depressed I am, but I mean it's again it's a humanizing thing, and so it's both useful in like presenting and in public speaking, but we talked about like building relationships in one-on-ones, and because it's something that I've been open about and will be open about. So at work, for example, like there are days where I just need to not be at work, right? Like I just can't and need a day off. And historically that was sort of stigmatized, right? Like you take a day off, you sort of have to explain it or whatever it is. And I think it's really valuable to give people an opportunity to take time off and give them the trust that if they need the time off, like they should be able to take it without a detailed explanation of what's going on with them. That being said, I am generally pretty open about the fact that like if I'm taking a sort of mental health day or whatever, that this is why I'm doing it. And what that means is sometimes in one-on-ones and with relationships that I have with reports, like they are more willing to talk about their challenges. And I'm not a therapist, I'm not a doctor, and the point of that is not sort of like so I can help them with it, but at least I can accommodate more effectively, I think. Like if I sort of, if they're able to tell me what's going on, again, like, I don't have no interest in being sort of intrusive and knowing more than I need to know about people's lives, but it's sometimes useful, like context, to know that this person is dealing with a long-term health condition and, they're having a difficult time with it right now, or, they're dealing with something at home that is, very stressful and, it's been affecting their performance at work. And if people aren't willing to talk about that, then I think like you can get into situations where, again, if performance gets impacted, you don't want to make assumptions about, oh, you know what, this person's just sort of not working out, when in fact, like, again, they have a real situation at home that's making it very hard for them to sort of concentrate at work. So the vulnerability piece, again, for me is like leading, or, being the one to open that door by talking about some of my own challenges. And, often that leads to people being more open with theirs, which in turn means I can support them better, which is, just great.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, there are some things that are kind of, so if you have a tendency towards depression or anxiety or something like that, like there are things you can do, but that's also a part of you. And I think it can be easy for some people to be like, well, I don't have that problem,
Yeah, yeah.
whatever. But some things are also situational. Like we're all going to run into this, right? I think a universal experience in life is grief. Someday we
Yeah.
will all lose someone important to us. And that is really, really hard, no matter who you are or what your situation is. And so having mental health and these things be something that we can talk about and we can acknowledge and understand as valid. And as you say, like, you don't have to go into details. You don't have to be like, oh my gosh, this thing happened and I've got to, and like
Yeah.
leak that all over work. But you can say, you know what? Like there's shit going on today and I need a day.
Yeah.
And to have that be something that leadership does normalizes it for everyone else.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing is like, just thinking about how, companies offer resources for these kinds of things, right? Mental health resources. And again, like offering those things, but not talking about them. Like, are you intentionally or unintentionally sort of further stigmatizing some of that stuff, where it's, you hold out, it's like holding out unlimited vacation, but like nobody actually takes it because because like you don't want to look like you're taking too much. So it's like, yes, we have, psychological services and stuff that you can tap into, but like nobody really does because that's weird. It's like, so I've talked to people about like, yeah, I've used our, this mental health care provider or whatever it is because I need help with this thing. And yeah, like you said, that doesn't have to be like, oh, because I had a massive depressive episode. It's like, oh, this thing happened in my life and I had trouble dealing with it. So like, I wanted to talk to somebody about it. So yeah, I tried out the service that we have that's, through our benefits to sort of like get that stuff. And then me trying that out means I can sort of like even provide advice or insight for people who are saying, well, I'm having this trouble. I'm like, well, you can try this service. It might not be it, but, I know what's out there. I know how it works because I've been through it. And, maybe that's all you need and that's fine. So yeah, I just, again, from my perspective of supporting the people that I work with, I find that I find that being, again, like open with sort of the stuff that I've done, just like it helps me support them better. And yeah, so far, yeah, no major downsides. Maybe one day I'll overshare, but yeah, so far it's I don't know. I like I said, I think being vulnerable is important for us when we're in a position to be able to do that. And yeah.
All right, that's it for this Human Skills interview. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel. You can also subscribe to the Human Skills newsletter, which there's a link to right down below, to get notified of interviews like this as they come out. Take care, y'all. This is K-Ball signing out.